Today we're going to go through a couple of movements to help us mobilize our, you guessed it, hips. What you'll need is a TheraBand or even a yoga strap and a block or maybe some books. So I'll invite you to come on down to the floor and start in a hook lying position. So knees bent, feet flat, and we'll start with our pelvic tilts. So finding those hip points, and you're going to rock those hip points towards the ribs and away from the ribs. So it can be really nice to start with mobilizing the pelvis, rocking the pelvis forward, that's hips away from ribs, rocking it back, that's hips towards ribs, just to set a baseline for how well is my pelvis moving and how well are my hip joints responding to that movement. And then we'll pause and we'll step the feet a little bit wider apart. If you were on a yoga mat, they'd be about mat width apart. And you're going to rotate the pelvis and drop the legs, knees over to one side, and then drop them over to the other side. So swaying the knees to one side and to the other side. So here we're mobilizing through both the hips, the thigh bones, and the pelvis. And so when you're doing this wide leg hip sway, you can let the pelvis turn to one side and then turn to the other side. Now try to keep the backs of your shoulders relatively heavy, and maybe just take note of the flexibility in your hip joints. And we're going to hope that towards the end of this series, the hip joints feel a little bit looser, as though we can get a little bit more range. All right, so now we bring our legs back to about hip joint distance apart. We pick up our band, loop it around the back of your thigh, and cross it over in the front of the thigh. Hold that band and drop your heel as close to your bum as you can. So the shin is very much dead weight. That knee is right above the hip joint. And then you start to circle your thigh bone in the hip socket. Ideally, you're moving the thigh bone with the support of the arms. So the arms are doing the lion's share of the work to move that thigh bone. You can think about this as the thigh bone stirring in the hip socket. The back of the pelvis is nice and level, equal weight through both left and right glute. And then we switch the direction of that circle. Double check that you are crossing midline a little bit and that your stance leg is nice and still, the knee continuously pointing up towards the ceiling. Set that side down and we'll switch. So get that band at the back of the thigh, and then a crossover gives you a little more support. Hold on, drop that shin, let the foot and shin be heavy. Starting position is knee directly above the hip joint, and then you circle around that starting place. So we're not trying to make the circles very big. You know, they're maybe the size of a tea saucer. And as you're doing this movement, it's going to be really common to start shifting and rotating the pelvis. And that's when you remind yourself to stay really heavy in the back of the sacrum, really heavy through each glute. And you rely on your arm strength to help stir that thigh bone, stir that femur in the socket. Switch the direction of your circle. And it might take you one or two repetitions to sort of find that rhythm in the new direction. Find that sack of potatoes, dead weight kind of feeling in the thigh bone, and get your arms to do most of the stirring as best you can. The upper body and chest are relaxed as the arms stir the leg. All right, setting that band aside and making our way to hands and knees with your block. So once you're in hands and knees position, you're going to start by placing that block in between the inner thighs. So get it as high as you comfortably can, making sure it's balanced, it's not off on a diagonal. Tuck those toes under and have a nice neutral spine. So your back isn't rounded and it's not overly dipped. And you're going to gently press into that block and start to shift your hips towards the wall behind you. And then reverse and come back. So your toes are tucked under, and that block is receiving a little bit of pressure from the inner thighs, in particular as you shift back. When you shift back, it might be tempting to tuck the tail under. You're not going to let that happen. You're attempting to widen through the base of the pelvis as the hips shift back. And then you reverse and come forward. You can think to yourself, wide sits bones as you hinge back. And then those sits bones narrow on the return. So widening the base of the pelvis, a little inner thigh pressure, and return. Nice and slow. And then we pause. You're going to take the block and set it on the floor, placing one knee up on the block. So I'm starting with my left knee, toes tucked, connected to the floor. And then we take our right leg and cross it over the left and plant those toes as well. So here, balance or level off the hip points and then shift the pelvis back just a little. Then, could you rotate the pelvis towards the left side? So you're rotating the pelvis towards the leg that's on the block. So here I'm dropping my right hip point down to turn that pelvis towards the block a little bit. I should be feeling a stretch through the back of the hip. And then to deepen that stretch, I'm going to come down onto my forearms. Push through the floor with your forearms. You're not sinking or hanging into it with your upper body. And you just redo that check. Is my left leg roughly vertical? And is my right hip point closer to the floor than the left? Meaning we want the pelvis to be turned towards the block slightly. And from here, you could even shift back just a little. Feel that widening, that length happening through the hip that's elevated on the block. And we'll breathe here for a few more moments. And then we'll come out of that on the elbows position and we'll switch sides. So now my right knee is coming up on the block, not my shin, right? I'm getting that right knee up onto the block so that on my right foot I can have those toes down, then crossing over the left leg. That left inner thigh is hugging the right inner thigh, and my left toes are on the floor. And then from here, dropping that left hip point a little bit towards the floor. And that's going to turn my pelvis towards the block, in this case, towards the right. You can shift the hips back a little bit, but mostly we want the thigh bone vertical. The block thigh bone is vertical. And then coming on to our forearms, right thigh bone still vertical, or maybe it's leaning a little bit to the right, but not too much. And then we double check that that pelvis is rotated towards the block leg. So that's the hip that we're working on stretching. Try to relax that right thigh bone deep into the socket, getting a deep stretch in the back of the hip. We'll do a couple more breaths here. And then come out of that position. Set your block off to the side. We're going to lay on our backs again. And we'll bring those feet a yoga mat distance apart and do that sway from side to side. And maybe noticing if it feels like you've got a little more range of motion, or the thigh bones are just moving with more freedom. And one more each side. And from here, you're welcome to come on up. And I'd recommend taking those loose, happy legs for a nice walk. Thank you and have a good day.